Hey guys, it's Charlie, and today I'm going to be making a new presidential tier list. I made one a little over 2 years ago, and my views have changed a lot since then. I was more of a libertarian kind of guy back then, but I've shifted my views quite a bit since then. As a result, some of my views on the presidents have changed as well. I feel like I was too harsh on some of them, so I've decided to redo this list so that my rankings better reflect my views today. So without further ado, let's get started. We begin with George Washington, the father of our nation. He goes in the S tier without question. This man led our country to independence. He set the stage for the presidency, protected our Constitution, and he never abused his power. He is owed a lot of gratitude for what he did and gave for this country. Up next is John Adams. He was a disappointing president overall. He signed laws that made it a crime to criticize the government, and he presided over a brief war with France, so I'm going to put him in D tier. Up next is Thomas Jefferson. He was a great president. He doubled the size of our country with the Louisiana Purchase. He led us to victory against the Barbary pirates, and he ended the slave trade while being a slave owner himself. Kind of ironic, but nevertheless, he goes up in A tier. Up next is James Madison. He was a pretty good president. He led us to the War of 1812, so I'll put him in B tier. Up next is James Monroe, a very good president. He presided over the era of good feelings and set the stage for 100 years of an America First foreign policy with the Monroe Doctrine. I will put him up in A tier. Up next is John Quincy Adams. He didn't do a whole lot, and he's the only president who was elected with neither the popular vote nor the electoral vote. I don't think he was a bad president per se, but he couldn't really do a whole lot, so he wasn't good either, so I'm going to put him in C tier. Up next is Andrew Jackson. He was a strong leader, a true man of the people. He successfully fought against the Second National Bank. He quashed the first real threat of a civil war in this country by putting down the nullification crisis. And he remains to this day the only president who fully got rid of the national debt, so his place on the $20 bill is well deserved. He did some bad things to the natives with the Trail of Tears, but I don't think we should knock him down the list too much for that, so I'm going to put him up in A tier. Up next is Martin Van Buren. This guy was a very irrelevant president, and the economy collapsed with the Panic of 1837, which he didn't respond adequately to, so I'll put him in D tier. Up next is William Henry Harrison. He only served about a month as president before he died of pneumonia. So I'm going to put him in the incomplete tier right here. If he wore a jacket at his inauguration, he'd probably have a ranking, but he didn't, so I can't rank him. Up next is John Tyler. He served for most of Harrison's term. He was another irrelevant president who really didn't have any meaningful impact on the country, so I'll put him in D tier. Up next is James K. Polk. Polk is probably the most underrated president we have ever had. He is the reason that our country is as big as it is. He put Manifest Destiny into overdrive. He made a pledge when he ran to get all this land out west within 4 years and then retire. He kept his promise. After winning the Mexican-American War, we got California, the Oregon Territory, all the remaining western parts of our country. He was a very effective leader and doesn't get enough credit, so I'm going to put him up in S tier. Up next is Zachary Taylor. He only served a little over a year as president before he died, and not a whole lot came out of him, so I'm going to put him in the incomplete tier as well. Up next is Millard Fillmore. He was another irrelevant president, and his support of the Compromise of 1850 helped set the stage for the Civil War, so I will put him in D tier. Up next is Franklin Pierce. He was a very weak president, and he supported the expansion of slavery out west, which helped spark Bleeding Kansas and just fanned the flames of a brewing civil war, so he belongs in F tier. Up next is James Buchanan. He was even weaker. He helped push the Supreme Court's decision on the Dred Scott case, which pushed the country over the edge. And worse, he refused to do anything to stop the southern states from seceding after Lincoln won in 1860, claiming he had no authority to do so. As such, for failing to even try to stop the country from collapsing, he belongs in F tier. Up next is Abraham Lincoln. I don't think I need to explain this one. This man led this country through its greatest test. He saved the country from breaking apart forever, and he abolished slavery. Did he overreach on his authority? Sure, but with the situation the country was in, he had no choice, and it ultimately paid off. This man was a fantastic leader who never lost hope for this country, and his assassination unfortunately left this country with much to be desired. So, I will put him in S tier as well. Next we have Andrew Johnson. He was a horrible president. This guy, he fought Congress every step of the way to prevent securing rights for the newly freed slaves, which set back civil rights for many years to come. He was the first president to be impeached, but it was because he wanted to fire a Secretary of War, which I think is ridiculous, but he still belongs in F tier. Up next is Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is actually a pretty underrated president. He was originally remembered for the corruption with his administration, but he wasn't personally corrupt. He just trusted the wrong people. Putting all that aside, he handled Reconstruction extremely well. He put out the first wave of the KKK and was a strong defender and protector of civil rights for African Americans. This all came to an end after he left office, and things really took a turn for the worst for the former slaves with the rise of Jim Crow after he was gone. All that being said, I'm going to put him up in B tier. Up next is Rutherford B. Hayes. He was another irrelevant president, and Reconstruction ended under his watch, so I'm going to put him in D tier. James A. Garfield, he's the last president I'm going to put in complete tier. He only served about 6 months before he was assassinated, and he was the second president to be assassinated. Not a whole lot came out of his presidency. Chester A. Arthur, another irrelevant president. He wasn't really he's not a very memorable one, so I'm going to put him up in D tier. Up next is Grover Cleveland, the first president to serve 2 terms non-consecutively. He was a pretty good president. He preserved the gold standard and was the king of vetoes. He vetoed well over 300 bills, preventing government overreach. So I'm going to put him up in B tier. Up next is Benjamin Harrison. He was all right. He protected industry, and he signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which he could have enforced better. So I'm going to put him in up in C tier. And after him, Cleveland served his second term, so we're going to skip ahead to William McKinley. He was a pretty solid leader. He presided over a time of economic prosperity, and he helped lead our country to a quick victory in the Spanish-American War. I'm split on whether or not the war was justified, but he handled it well nevertheless. I'm going to put him up in B tier. And his second term, sadly, was cut short because of his assassination, which gives us Theodore Roosevelt, the bull moose himself. I was too hard on Teddy in the past. I've seen the light now. Theodore Roosevelt is a legend. He brought upon an era of trust busting, preserving our natural resources, and keeping our food and drugs pure. He dug out the Panama Canal and brokered peace with Russia and Japan. With that bully pulpit philosophy, he used presidential power to accomplish things quickly, which I believe is often a necessary thing to do. And it's something that future presidents should take notes from, as long as it doesn't explicitly violate the Constitution. I love Theodore Roosevelt, so I'm gonna put him up in S tier. Up next is William Howard Taft. He was nowhere near as energetic as Teddy was, but he wasn't a bad president. He was more of a classic smaller government kind of conservative, which for his time was not necessarily a bad thing. He still broke up a lot of monopolies, even more than Teddy did. He went on to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States years later, which put even more good influence on this country. So I'm going to put him up in B tier. Up next is Woodrow Wilson. Now, although I love Teddy Roosevelt, I blame him for putting this tyrant in office. He only won in 1912 because of Teddy's ego trip, and that set the country down a dark path. Woodrow Wilson, he created the cancerous Federal Reserve. He imposed segregation on the federal government and was the epitome of what the executive branch should not become. He flip-flopped on World War I, and he used the war as an excuse to go after his political opponents and restrict freedom of speech with the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act. This guy was just a horrific leader and set a bad precedent for this country. I'm going to put him in F tier. Up next is Warren G. Harding. he meant well on a lot of things, but he was not a good president. He was pretty lazy and just allowed his administration to get corrupt, particularly with Teapot Dome. So I'm going to put him in D tier. I don't want to rag on him too much because he only served a little over 2 years before he died. Next is Calvin Coolidge. They call him Silent Cal for a reason. He didn't do a whole lot, but not doing anything is what made him really good. He presided over a time of economic prosperity, and he was like the last president that truly believed that the government is not the answer to our problems. So I'm going to put him up in A tier. Next is Herbert Hoover. This guy objectively is one of the worst presidents we've ever had because the economy collapsed into the Great Depression, and his efforts to fix the problem only made it worse, and he just was not a good communicator. So I'm going to put him in F tier too. Up next is Franklin D. Roosevelt. I've been kind of hard on FDR in the past. I'm not a huge fan of the New Deal, but I also recognize that it was the right thing for him to do at that time since the nation was in a depression, and it's what the people wanted because it gave them hope and helped them get back on their feet. He was also a great leader during World War II. He mobilized the country for war fairly quickly, and he allowed the generals to do what they had to do to win the war and not let bureaucracy get in the way. So I'm going to put him in A tier. Next is Harry S. Truman. He was a decent president. He made the tough but the right decision to drop the atomic bomb, and his handling of the post-World War II economy was good, and he sent a strong message against communism, but I don't think his handling of the Korean War was good. I think he should have let MacArthur do what he wanted to do, and he didn't do that, and the Korean War just dragged on longer than it needed to be. So I'm going to put him in B tier. Up next is Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'm going to put him in S tier because this guy was a phenomenal president. He was very tough on illegal immigration. He deported illegal immigrants quickly, which is something that I think Donald Trump should take notes from when he takes office in January. He presided over a time of unprecedented economic prosperity. He pulled us out of Korea, and he built our interstate highway system, which expanded our ability to travel throughout the country. And so many things were just added to the cultural world under him. The only downside that I could think of with him was that he appointed a lot of Supreme Court justices who were a little too liberal, but he expressed regret for them later on. So I'm going to keep him up in S tier. He was phenomenal. Up next is John F. Kennedy. He's very overrated. He gets a lot more credit than he deserves because of the assassination. He screwed up Bay of Pigs pretty badly. He did handle the Cuban Missile Crisis well, and he was a strong anti-communist, but he's still pretty overrated overall, so I'm going to put him in C tier. Up next is Lyndon B. Johnson. This guy was awful. He expanded the welfare state with his Great Society, and this has just helped destroy the family and increase our reliance on the government. And full-scale deployment of troops, of American troops in Vietnam happened under his watch, and he completely screwed up the war with a terrible strategy. I mean, we lost 58,000 men for a country that had no desire to fight communism. We dropped more bombs during the Vietnam War than we did in World War II. This guy was just a terrible leader, terrible president. I'm going to put him in F tier. Up next is Richard Nixon. He really wasn't a big improvement from LBJ. He pulled our troops out of Vietnam while increasing the bombing of Vietnam. He helped normalize relations with China, and that's led to the rise of a competitor that threatens our place as the world's leader today. And this goes without mentioning Watergate. So I'm going to put him in D tier. Up next is Gerald Ford. He didn't really do a whole lot. There really wasn't much he could do. He is a bit of a Chad, though, because he survived 2 assassination attempts. But, you had a bunch of things that were happening under his watch. Inflation was spiraling out of control and all that. But there really wasn't anything he could do about it, so I'm going to put him in D tier. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was terrible. I mean, inflation just kept getting worse under him. The economy kept getting worse under him. He also had the Iranian hostage crisis, which he could have handled a lot better. And his attempt to rescue the hostages with Desert One was an embarrassing failure. He was just a very weak leader, so I'm going to put him in F tier. Next is Ronald Reagan. Now, the more I look back on Reagan, the less I like him because, yeah, I mean, he was pretty good on the economy. You know, he cut taxes and all that stuff, and the economy was really great during his term. And he also set the stage for the collapse of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and all that other stuff. But he passed gun control into law. He also passed mass amnesty into law, which is not a good thing. And he was a pretty neoconservative kind of president, and that was just illustrated with the Iran-Contra affair. So I think I'm gonna put him in B tier. I'm really not as big of a fan of him as I used to be. Next is George H.W. Bush. He was a very mediocre president. He broke his promise not to raise taxes, which doomed his presidency, and not even the Persian Gulf War could save him, which he did handle well. Credit due there, but still, I'm gonna put him in D tier. Next is Bill Clinton. You know, Bill Clinton was actually not that bad because he was like the last true moderate Democrat president. You know, he compromised a lot with the Republicans and Newt Gingrich. You actually saw a budget surplus under him. The economy was pretty decent. And that crime bill that he signed into law, I was critical of that in the past, but you know, looking at the crime wave the past few years, you know, that bill actually was a pretty good thing, and it did bring crime down a lot. So I think I'm going to put him in C tier. Next is George W. Bush. This guy was a full-on neocon president. After 9/11, he just used 9/11 to exploit everybody's fears and start a completely unnecessary war in Iraq, which he dropped the ball on totally. He completely screwed up Afghanistan. We had bin Laden. He just went into Pakistan, but instead of going to Pakistan, we decided to go to Iraq, which I don't understand. He also started the surveillance state with the Patriot Act, and look how that's turned out. The economy collapsed in 2007, 2008. Subprime mortgage crisis happened, and he did not handle that well at all. So I'm going to put him in F tier as well. Next is Barack Obama. Not an Obama fan at all. He was a full-on liberal. He dragged on the wars. Terrorism began to expand. Obamacare was a massive disaster. It just spiraled out of control. And the recovery from the recession was really slow. Most unfortunately, though, it was under him where American culture began to take a massive dive, where a lot of people just became less proud to be American, and he wasn't receptive to that at all. And we're still feeling the effects of that to this day. So I'm going to put him in F tier too. Next is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is my favorite president of my lifetime, primarily because of this America First movement he inspired to help preserve and save our culture. In terms of policy, I like what he did for the economy with tax cuts and fair trade agreements. He's been a strong advocate for securing our border. He's just been very good rhetorically and policy-wise. I think the issues of COVID and BLM in 2020 really set him back a lot, which caused him to lose the presidency. But he pressed on, and despite everything that the left threw at him, whether it was impeachments, indictments, frivolous lawsuits, bogus convictions, or even bullets, he fought and fought and fought, and he won back the presidency last month, and I am super excited to see him finish what he started. So I'm going to put him in A tier, and maybe S tier if things really work out in his next term. Up next is Joe Biden. F tier. F tier. I mean, what else can I say? He just opened up the border, just flooded the country with all these migrants. He was responsible for the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Prices just skyrocketed because of his unnecessary COVID stimulus and inhibiting energy production. The guy can't even form two coherent sentences without losing his train of thought. I'm very glad he's leaving office soon, and I'm even more glad his cackling toady lost. And so, there you have it. This is my updated presidential tier list. Share it, leave a like, feel free to comment. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you later.